We are going to see in the advanced economy somewhat tighter monetary conditions as we move forwards over the next few years. However, at the same time, there's going to be much less fiscal tightening in the advanced economies than there was recently. And the two things together will make for 2014 higher growth. So let's go through this in steps. You may have heard that recently monetary conditions in the United States have tightened. This follows the so-called talk about tapering by Chairman Bernanke in his testimony to Congress. So I'm showing you here what happened over the last 6 months to very short-term interest rates between the period T, which is now, and 3 years. So short-term interest rates that prevail today and that are expected to prevail in 36 months. This is the way the curve for the US, for the US looked in April. And now you can see how it has moved up. Markets now expect higher rates. Same thing in Europe than they did 6 months ago. However, notice the axis here. It goes from 0 to 0.5%. So even over the next 36 months, markets are expecting short-term policy rates to remain very low. The more relevant fact is actually what happened to long-term interest rates, so 10-year rates. And you can see this here. You see in green the 10-year rates for the United States and in yellow for Germany. And recently they have been moving up, and by non-negligible amounts, by over 100 basis points in the US and close to 100 basis points in Germany. That is the tightening in condition that has happened. In the United States, it also has happened. Then it has transmitted to 30-year mortgages. Mortgages have become more expensive, and this, of course, slows down activity in housing markets. But the pertinent question is, so what are we expecting going forwards from where we are right now? And for that, what is really important is to understand what is the outlook for inflation and for economic slack in the economy. So for inflation, you see our forecast here. I'm just not going to talk about Japan. We can talk about this in the Q&A, but focus instead on the US and Europe. And we're seeing that inflation in both of these is currently running pretty close to 1%. In the euro area, below 1%, in the US, slightly above 1%. And the targets of these central banks are either close to but below 2 in the case of the ECB, or 2 or a little above in the case of the Federal Reserve. And for both of them, we expect inflation to remain below 2% going forwards. And so our view is that there won't be, while the United States Fed may start tapering over the next 6 months, we expect short-term interest rates to remain on hold until 2016 in the United States, and we have a similar forecast for Europe. So not much of a tightening in the offing on that front. Here I'm showing you a picture of economic slack. You can see here in red, you can see the unemployment rate in the United States. It's still far above pre-crisis levels, right? It's come down quite a bit, from above 9% to well below 8%. But when you look at the employment rate, it has actually barely recovered from the crisis trough. What's going on here? Many people who have lost their jobs have left the labor market and therefore are not showing up in the unemployment rate. There is thus still, in our view, a lot of slack left, a lot of scope for employment to rise without inflation accelerating. So monetary conditions are assumed to remain very accommodative. What about fiscal policy? One way to measure fiscal policy is to compute by how much your deficit will decline while adjusting for the cycle, right? I mean, if growth picks up, your revenues will pick up, but that is not a fiscal tightening, really. The fiscal tightening is what happens, at a constant level of activity. And you can see how this was actually rather high. I mean, for example, in the euro area in 2012, it amounted to the equivalent of about 1.5% of euro area GDP. Now, for 2012, the growth rate in the euro area was below 0, like I think minus 0.5 or something like this. I don't have the exact number in my head. Now, you can pick your favorite multiplier. If your fiscal multiplier is 1, then you can argue, well, if there hadn't been 1.5% fiscal tightening, there would have been growth in the euro area of, instead of minus 0.5, of plus 1. In the United States, growth has been hampered this year by a very large amount of fiscal tightening to the tune of almost 2.5% of GDP. That is the sequester that happened in 2013. For this year, our forecast for the US economy is growth of 1.5%. If this tightening had not taken place, again, if your multiplier was 1, there would have been 4% sorry, there would have been, 4% growth almost in the US economy. The Fed estimates that growth absent this fiscal tightening might have been between 3 and 3.5%. But the important point is, going forwards, we are seeing much less fiscal tightening in both the US and the euro area. And that will make for better domestic demand and therefore an increase in growth. You can see this increase in the growth rate here. This is here between 0 and 3%. We are starting out, we are presently here, and then there's going to be a little more weakening this year because of the fiscal tightening, and then there's going to be a gradual increase in growth. And for next year, our forecast for the US economy is for growth of around 2.5%, up from 1.5% this year.